The obsidian rotunda of the High Synod was not designed for silence, yet silence was the only occupant that commanded respect within its towering, crystalline walls. The architecture itself was a testament to the aesthetic perfection of the Ethelgardian ascendancy. Soaring arches of grown bioluminescent coral, floors of polished void glass that reflected the swirling nebulae outside, and the hum of zero-point energy fields keeping the atmosphere smelling of ozone and crushed lilacs. It was a place built to celebrate eternal victory, a chamber where the masters of 1,000 star systems convened to dictate the flow of history. But today, the history being dictated was one of ash and retreat. The air was thick with the psychological weight of an empire realizing its own mortality, a suffocating pressure that pressed down on the mantle of High Exarch Valen. He stood by the panoramic viewport, his elongated, multi-jointed fingers resting on the cool surface of the transparency, watching the distant glitter of defensive fleets moving into holding patterns. They looked like jewels strung against the velvet of space, elegant, teardrop-shaped vessels of white gold and azure light, pulsing with the energy of stars. They were beautiful. They were the pinnacle of civilized engineering. And they were burning across the outer rim, system by system, turned into drifting slag by an enemy that did not care for beauty. Valen turned slowly, his heavy robes of woven light rustling with a sound like dry leaves, a noise that seemed too loud in the oppressive quiet. The council was seated in the amphitheater below him, a sea of faces from a dozen uplifted species, all looking to him for salvation that he did not possess. The holographic projection in the center of the room displayed the galactic arm, a spiral of light that was being consumed by an encroaching darkness, the Null Architects. They were not merely invaders. They were an entropy made manifest, a species or phenomenon that dismantled the fundamental forces of physics that the Ascendancy relied upon. Where the Ethelgardian ships used elegant shields of coherent light, the Null used dampening fields that unraveled the photons. Where the Ascendancy used plasma, the Null used gravitational inversions. It was a war of art against oblivion, and art was losing. Valen cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the acoustic perfection of the room, causing several junior delegates to flinch. He looked at the datapad floating beside him, the contents of which were the source of the current, heated, terrified debate. "The proposal stands," Valen said, his voice vibrating with a fatigue that spanned centuries. "We have exhausted our reserves. The Grand Armada is at 40% operational capacity. The outer colonies are silent. The Null Architects will breach the inner sanctum of the core worlds within a standard solar cycle. We have no kinetic options left. We have no energy reserves left. The only response to our distress signal is this." He gestured, and the holographic display shifted. The beautiful, terrifying map of the war vanished, replaced by a granular, low-resolution scan of a single vessel. A murmur of disbelief bordering on offense rippled through the council chamber. The image was grainy not because of sensor failure, but because the object absorbed so much scanning radiation that it appeared as a hole in the data. It was not a teardrop. It was not a sphere of perfect geometry. It was a brick. A jagged, asymmetrical, scarring block of dark matter and metal, bristling with protrusions that looked like scaffolding, unfinished construction, or perhaps the wreckage of a dozen other ships welded together in a fevered dream of desperation. "This is the response from the Terran Union," Valen announced, keeping his tone neutral, though his internal hearts were sinking with shame. "They call it the UNS Hephaestus." A loud, chittering laugh broke the solemnity. It came from Fleetmaster Zykes, a crustacean strategist whose carapace was polished to a sheen that rivaled the floor. Zykes stood, his multiple legs clicking on the void glass. "You insult us, Exarch. We face the death of the light, the unraveling of the subatomic bonds of our civilization, and you present us with. Refuse? Look at the thermal bleed on that structure. It is hemorrhaging heat like a dying star. It has no coherence fields. The sensory profile suggests chemical combustion engines for maneuvering. Chemical? They are burning dead fluid to move in the vacuum. It is a piece of junk, Exarch, a floating tomb. If this is humanity's champion, then humanity is already dead, and they have sent us their coffin." Valen closed his eyes for a moment. He understood the Fleetmaster's revulsion. The Ascendancy valued elegance. Efficiency was defined by the ratio of energy output to visual harmony. A ship that looked ugly was, by their definition, a bad ship. The Terrans were a young species, admitted to the G. Galactic stage only out of pity and curiosity. They were industrious, yes, but crude. They built with alloys and rivets while the Ascendancy grew ships from crystal and light. They used projectile weapons, slugs of metal thrown by magnetic rails, which was considered a barbarism akin to throwing rocks. They were the children of the galaxy, loud, messy, and prone to breaking things. And now, in the 11th hour, the children had sent a toy to fight a god. "It is not a coffin, Fleetmaster," Valen said, opening his eyes and staring down the insectoid general. "It is a request for docking clearance. They have arrived at the perimeter of the Valcora system. They claim to be the Vanguard. They claim this vessel is capable of holding the line." "Holding the line?" Another counselor spoke, a slender, ethereal being made of shifting gas held in a containment suit. "Against the null, that thing will be deconstructed before it can fire its whatever primitive cannons it possesses. It is a waste of docking space. Tell them to turn back. We will die with dignity, not hiding behind a wall of scrap metal." "We do not have the luxury of dignity," Valen snapped, his voice finally cracking with the anger he had suppressed. "We are dying. If the Terrans wish to throw their scrap at the null to buy us a microsecond of time, I will not stop them. Grant the clearance. Let the humans Let them bring their Hephaestus to the front. If nothing else, its destruction will provide a debris field that might confuse the enemy sensors for a moment." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket of despair. The counselors muttered, their pride wounded, their fear unassuaged. They looked at the hologram of the Terran ship, that ugly, scarred, blackened slab of metal, and saw only the reflection of their own hopelessness. If this was the best the galaxy could muster, then the ascendancy was truly finished. Valen waved his hand, dismissing the hologram, but the image lingered in his mind. There was something about the ship, something the sensors weren't picking up, or perhaps something his intuition was screaming at him. It was ugly, yes, but it was also dense. It felt heavy in a way that the ascendancy ships with their mass lightning fields never did. It sat in the void like a mountain sits on a plain, immovable, stubborn. The transition from the High Synod to the tactical command deck of the orbital defense station was a journey from theoretical despair to practical terror. The command deck was a hive of activity, but it was the activity of a crew preparing for execution. Alarms were muted to a dull thrum, red lights bathed the faces of the operators in the color of blood, and the main view screen showed the edge of the system where the fabric of space was beginning to bruise. The null architects were arriving. They did not use warp gates. They simply pressed against reality until it tore. Great fissures of violet and black energy opened in the starfield, bleeding entropy into the vacuum. From these wounds in the universe emerged the null fleet, shards of absolute darkness, geometrical nightmares that defied the eye, shapes that seemed to twist and invert as they moved. They absorbed light. They absorbed hope. And between the magnificent, fragile fleet of the Ascendancy and this encroaching darkness, the Terran ship arrived. It did not warp in with a flash of Cherenkov radiation. It did not shimmer into existence. It simply slammed into real space with a gravitational concussion that shook the sensors of the entire fleet. The UNS Hephaestus. Seeing it with the naked eye on the view screen was even more jarring than the hologram. It was colossal. It was a rectangular prism of dull, non-reflective metal, pockmarked with craters, scorched by cosmic radiation, and seemingly held together by gravity and stubbornness. It was covered in antennae heat sinks that glowed a dull, angry crimson and massive, spinal-mounted protrusions that could only be weapon barrels of archaic design. It looked like a city block ripped from the surface of a dead industrial world and hurled into the stars. "Visual contact confirmed," a sensor officer reported, her voice trembling. "Terran vessel Hephaestus holding position at Vector 99. They are hailing us, Exarch, audio only." "Put it through," Valen commanded from the central dais. The speakers crackled with static, analog static, a sound the Ascendancy had filtered out of their communications eons ago. Then a voice cut through. It was not the melodic, synthesized tone of a translator, but a rough, deep voice speaking the trade tongue with a heavy, gravelly accent. It sounded like stones grinding together. "This is Admiral Hideo Vance of the United Terran Navy, commanding the dreadnought Hephaestus," the voice rumbled. "We read the enemy's signature. Looks like you folks have a bit of a pest problem, requesting permission to advance and engage." "Flee." Headmaster Zykes, standing beside Valen, scoffed loud enough for the pickup to catch. "Admiral, this is Fleetmaster Zykes. Your vessel is leaking thermal radiation. Your shields are non-existent on our scanners. The enemy uses entropy fields that dismantle matter at a molecular level. You are flying a piece of unshielded iron into a supernova. Withdraw immediately, or you will be vaporized." There was a pause on the line, a long, heavy silence. Then a sound that might have been a chuckle, dry and humorless. "We don't use energy shields, Fleetmaster. We found they tend to fail when you need them most. As for the thermal leak, well, the reactor runs a little hot. We like it that way. Permission to engage, or are you going to keep talking while they eat your flank?" Valen watched the tactical map. The null shards were accelerating. The first volley of their antimatter lances was already streaking toward the Ascendancy cruisers on the perimeter. Two of the beautiful, white-gold ships simply vanished, their shields flickering and dying instantly under the onslaught, their hulls turning to dust. "Permission granted, Admiral," Valen whispered. "May the stars have mercy on your soul." "We don't need mercy," Vance replied, the transmission cutting with a sharp click. "We brought the hammer." On the view screen, the Hephaestus began to move. It was agonizingly slow at first. Clouds of gas vented from its flanks, chemical thrusters firing to orient the massive bulk. It didn't glide, it lurched. It was a beast waking up from a slumber. And then the main engines ignited, not the clean blue ion streams of the Ascendancy, but pillars of raw, blinding white fire, nuclear pulse propulsion. The sheer violence of the acceleration sent shockwaves through the local medium. The ship roared toward the oncoming tide of darkness, a solitary, ugly speck of matter against a tsunami of void. "They are insane," Zykes muttered, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "Look at their trajectory. They are putting themselves directly in the path of the Null flagship. That construct is a planet killer. It will strip the atoms from their hull before they are within firing range." The Null fleet reacted to the new arrival with predatory indifference. A squadron of the dark shards peeled off from the main formation, darting toward the Hephaestus like piranhas toward a wounded whale. They fired their entropy beams, purple lances of negation that had torn through the Ascendancy's strongest force fields like paper. The beams struck the Hephaestus. The bridge crew of the station flinched, expecting the explosion, expecting the debris cloud. But there was no explosion. The beams hit the hull of the Terran ship and, splashed, they washed over the dark metal, dissipating in showers of harmless sparks. The hull glowed slightly brighter, turning from matte black to a dull cherry red where the beams struck, but it did not buckle. It did not dissolve. "Sensor report," Valen shouted, leaning forward, his grip on the railing tightening until the metal groaned. "Why are they not dead? Why is that ship still there?" "Analyzing," the sensor officer's voice pitched up in confusion. "Exarch, the Terran hull, it's not standard alloy, it's incredibly dense. The readings are off the charts. It's layers upon layers of ablative armor, high-density tungsten, lead, and some kind of polymer we've never seen. The entropy beams are trying to dismantle the molecular bonds, but there is just too much matter. The ship is so physically dense that the energy disperses before it can achieve critical breakdown. It's a sponge, it's absorbing the fire." "They built a ship," Zykes breathed, horror and fascination warring in his tone. "That is simply too thick to die." "They are returning fire," the officer shouted. From the flanks of the Hephaestus, the scaffolding-like protrusions shifted. They were not sensors. They were railguns, massive magnetic accelerators running the length of the ship. There was no whine of charging lasers, no hum of plasma, just a series of dull, rhythmic thumps that resonated through the vacuum detected by the station's hull sensors. Flashes of light erupted from the Terran ship, muzzle flashes. Great plumes of burning gas as projectiles the size of shuttlecraft were hurled at a significant fraction of the speed of light. These were not energy beams. They were solid slugs of ferric tungsten, kinetic kill vehicles with no guidance systems, no electronics to be jammed, no energy matrix to be unraveled. They were dumb, brutal physics. The Null shards, accustomed to fighting energy shields and electronic warfare, attempted to deploy their dispersion fields. The fields, designed to scatter lasers and plasma, did absolutely nothing against a 20-ton slug moving at relativistic speeds. The first slug impacted a Null destroyer. There was no elegance. The alien ship didn't dissolve or fade, it shattered. The kinetic impact transferred so much energy that the target simply ceased to exist as a coherent structure, vaporized instantly by the heat of the collision. Its fragments turned into shrapnel that tore through the ships behind it. Thump, thump, thump. The Hephaestus was a broadside of destruction. It plowed through the enemy formation, its hull glowing brighter and brighter as it absorbed the enemy fire, trading heat for position. It was a brawler walking into a room of fencers, ignoring their rapiers and smashing them with a sledgehammer. "By the void," Valen whispered. "It's not a warship, it's a battering ram." The tactical map changed. The red markers of the Null fleet began to wink out, not one by one, but in clusters. The Terran ship was drawing all the fire, its immense gravitational signature and aggressive posture acting as a taunt. The Null, confused by this anomaly that refused to follow the laws of energy warfare, focused everything on the Hephaestus. "Admiral Vance to command," the voice crackled again, sounding slightly strained now, underscored by the screaming of alarms in the background. "We're taking a bit of a pounding here. Armor integrity on the port bow is down to 60%. We're getting warm, requesting the Ascendancy fleet to flank them while we have their attention. Don't mind the crossfire, we're built for it." He is ordering us to use him as a shield," Zyke said, stunned. "He is inviting friendly fire because he knows his ship can take it better than the enemy." Valen snapped out of his daze. This was the moment. The piece of junk had done the impossible. It had turned the tide of fear. "All ships," Valen roared, his voice amplified across the entire fleet network. "Form up on the Terran dreadnought, use their wake, target the enemy vessels distracted by the Hephaestus, fire at will." The battle that followed was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of contrasting violence. The sleek, elegant ships of the Ascendancy darted in the shadow of the Terran brick, firing their precise beams into the exposed flanks of the Null fleet. The Hephaestus took the brunt of the abuse. It was struck by gravity bombs that crumpled its outer armor like tin foil. It was bathed in radiation that would have sterilized a planet. It lost antennas, turrets, and entire sections of its outer cladding. But it never stopped firing. Its main guns, the spinal mounts, finally engaged. A beam of pure darkness. No, not a beam. A solid rod of metal accelerated to such speed that the friction of its passage through the microscopic dust of space created a tunnel of plasma. It struck the Null flagship, a construct the size of a moon. The impact was silent in the void, but the visual was apocalyptic. The flagship buckled, a crater forming in its center that went miles deep. The shockwave of the impact shattered the flagship's internal structure. As the Null fleet broke, scattering into the dark void from which they came, the Hephaestus finally ceased its forward momentum. It drifted, listing slightly to the side. It was a wreck. It was glowing white-hot in places, venting atmosphere, debris trailing from it like blood. It looked more like a piece of junk now than it ever had. But to Valen, watching the retreat of the enemy for the first time in a decade, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The shuttle ride to the Hephaestus was tense. Valen and Zykes were accompanied by a detail of honor guards, but the mood was one of humility, not ceremony. As they approached the Terran ship, the sheer scale of the damage became apparent. The hull was scarred with trenches of melted metal. There were holes that one could fly a fighter through. Yet lights still flickered in the windows. Repair crews in bulky yellow exosuits were already crawling over the surface, welding plates back together, their movements efficient and calm. They docked at an airlock that looked more like a bank vault door. The air inside smelled of machine oil, recycled oxygen, and something acrid, coffee, Valen would later learn. The gravity was heavy, slightly higher than standard, pulling at Valen's frail bones. The corridors were cramped, lined with pipes and conduits that hissed and clanked. There were no holographic displays, only analog gauges with needles twitching. They were led to the bridge, a command center that resembled a submarine's conning tower more than a starship deck. Admiral Vance stood by the central tactical table, a physical table covered in paper charts and screens. He was a shorter man than the Ethel Guardians, broad-shouldered, with gray hair cropped close to his skull, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same material as his ship. He wore a simple gray uniform, stained with grease on the sleeve. He held a ceramic cup in one hand. "Exarch," Vance nodded, not bowing. "Fleetmaster, glad you could make it over. Sorry about the mess. We haven't had time to cool down the radiators." "Admiral," Valen said, inclining his head deeply. Gesture of supreme respect. "You have saved the Ascendancy. You have done what our greatest fleets could not. We owe you an explanation and an apology. We judged your vessel by its appearance. We called it primitive." Vance chuckled, taking a sip from his cup. "Primitive? Maybe. We like to call it resilient. You see, Exarch, humanity didn't have the luxury of zero-point energy or grown crystals when we first left our gravity well. We had steel, titanium, and physics. We found out the hard way that the universe is a rough neighborhood. Fancy tech is great until it breaks. But a meter of solid tungsten, that never breaks. It just gets dented." Fleetmaster Zykes walked over to one of the bulkheads, running a claw along a jagged weld. "The Null Architects. Their weapons dismantle energy. They prey on high-technology civilizations because they feed on the complexity of the systems. But you..." "We are a rock," Vance said simply. "You can't short-circuit a rock, you can't hack a rock, and if you shoot a rock, it's still a rock. We built the Hephaestus not to be the fastest or the smartest ship. We built it to be the last one standing." "But the cost," Valen said, looking around at the bridge crew who looked exhausted, sweating in the heat of the cooling ship. "You took fire that would have destroyed a fleet. How can you endure such punishment?" Vance set his cup down. His expression grew serious, his eyes darkening. "That's the part we don't put in the brochures, Exarch. You asked why we built a ship like this, why we prioritize survival over elegance. It's not just because we're stubborn." He tapped a command into the console. The screens on the wall flickered, changing from the tactical view of the recent battle to a star chart. But this was not a chart of the Ascendancy's territory. It was a chart of the unknown regions, the dark space beyond the galactic rim. "The Null Architects," Vance said quietly, "are not the invaders, they are the refugees." The silence on the bridge was absolute. Valen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. Refugees, they consume stars, they dismantle reality. "They are running," Vance corrected. "They are dismantling stars to build fuel for a journey. They are trying to leave this galaxy as fast as they can. We found out 10 years ago. We intercepted their signals. They aren't attacking us because they hate us. They are attacking us because we are in their way and they are terrified." "Terrified of what?" Zykes asked, his voice barely a whisper. Vance gestured to the screen, where a red pulsing zone marked the edge of the intergalactic void. "There is something coming from the deep dark, something that eats the null, something that doesn't just dismantle energy but consumes consciousness. The null are trying to burn a path to the other side of the universe to escape it." The Admiral leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "We built the Hephaestus and her sister ships not to fight the null. We built them to fight what's chasing them. We knew that energy shields wouldn't work. We knew that delicate systems would fail. We needed ships that could function in a reality where the laws of physics are breaking down. We needed ships that were dead inside so they couldn't be eaten." Valen stared at the human. He looked at the crude, brutal ship around him. He realized now that he was not looking at a piece of junk. He was looking at a bunker, a storm cellar built by a species that had looked at the weather forecast and seen a hurricane that would wipe the galaxy clean. "You knew," Valen said. "You knew this whole time, and you came to help us anyway." "We need allies," Vance said. "The Null are panicked animals. They're dangerous, but they can't be reasoned with. You, the Ascendancy, you have resources, you have science, we have the iron, we have the wall. If we combine your tech with our hulls, maybe we stand a chance." Vance looked up, his eyes meeting Valen's. "The Hephaestus isn't the most advanced warship because of its guns, Exarch. It's the most advanced because it was built for the war that hasn't started yet. The Null was just a live-fire exercise." The gravity of the statement settled over the room. The victory against the Null Architects, which had seemed like a miracle moments ago, now felt like a prelude. The celebrations preparing on the planet below seemed premature. But as Valen looked at the human admiral, calm, drinking his coffee, standing in the heart of a ship that was essentially a weaponized mountain, he felt a strange, new emotion. It wasn't hope exactly. It was resolve. The Ascendancy had spent thousands of years pursuing perfection, fragility, and light. They had forgotten that the universe was dark and heavy. The humans had not forgotten. They had embraced the weight. "Admiral," Valen said, straightening his back, "the Ascendancy formally requests an alliance. We will open our shipyards to you. We will trofit your hulls with our engines, our sensors, and perhaps you can teach us how to build walls." Vance smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "We can do that. But first, Exarch, do you have any real food on that station? MREs are good for morale, but I'd kill for a fresh steak." "I believe," Valen said, allowing a small smile of his own, "that can be arranged." As the diplomats and the soldiers began to talk, planning the integration of two vastly different philosophies of war, the UNS Hephaestus drifted in the silence of the void. Its hull was cooling, the red glow fading to black. It hung there, scarred and ugly, a jagged shard of defiance against the infinite night. Far beyond the sensors of the fleet, in the deep dark between galaxies, a shadow moved, vast, hungry, and ancient. It sensed the battle. It sensed the energy. And for the first time in eons, it sensed something that it could not instantly devour. Something hard, something cold, something human. The junk had risen, and it was ready for the real war. The diplomatic summit that followed the Battle of Valcora was unlike any in the history of the Ascendancy. Usually, these events were held in the Spire of Whispers, a floating palace of glass and light. But at Admiral Vance's insistence, the initial strategic council was held in the primary hangar bay of the Hephaestus. It was a calculated move. Vance wanted the aliens to smell the oil. He wanted them to see the welders' sparks cascading from the ceiling where repairs were underway. He wanted them to understand the visceral reality of human survival. Delegates from the 12-member species of the Ascendancy stood on the scarred deck plating, looking uncomfortable in their shimmering robes and biosuits. They were surrounded by loader mechs, massive bipedal machines piloted by humans who were moving crates of ammunition that weighed more than an Ascendancy interceptor. The sheer industrial noise was deafening to the sensitive audio receptors of the Silith, a bat-like species, who had to adjust their dampeners. Valen stood at the center of the gathering, flanked by Fleetmaster Zykes and Admiral Vance. A large holographic table had been set up, a stark contrast to the gritty surroundings. It displayed the galactic map, but now, thanks to the data transfer from the Hephaestus, it showed the trajectory of the Null Architects, and more disturbingly, the shadow that pursued them. "We call them the Entropics," Vance explained, pointing to the sprawling darkness encroaching from the intergalactic void. "Our deep-range probes picked them up 20 years ago. They don't just consume matter, they consume the probability of matter existing. When they pass through a system, they don't leave ruins, they leave nothing, no atoms, no background radiation, just a true void." A murmur of horror rippled through the delegates. A representative of the aquatic Hydari bubbled in their tank, the translation matrix outputting a sound of distress. "And you believe we can fight this? The Null are fleeing it, and the Null nearly destroyed us." "The Null are fleeing because they are made of exotic energy," Vance replied, his voice calm and authoritative. "They are delicious to the Entropics, bright lights in a dark room, the Ascendancy, no offense. Your bright lights too, high energy output, active psionics, you light up the dinner table." Vance tapped the console, highlighting the Terran sector. "We, on the other hand, are quiet. We run cold. Our technology is based on kinetic impact and chemical reaction. To the Entropics, we're barely there. We're background noise. That gives us an advantage. We can hurt them before they even know they're in a fight." "You propose we regress?" Fleetmaster Zykes asked, his antennae twitching. "You want us to dismantle our fleets, abandon our energy shields, and build bricks?" "No," Vance said. "I want you to armor your souls. We don't want you to become us. We want to build a hybrid. Your engines can move mass faster than ours. Your sensors can see things we can't. But you need armor, you need density, and you need to stop relying on energy weapons that can be eaten." He gestured to the hangar behind him. A massive railgun turret, detached from the hull for maintenance, hung from a crane. "We have the blueprints for the Titan-class dreadnought. It's 3 times the size of the Hephaestus. We couldn't build it alone. We don't have the refined materials or the shipyard capacity. But you do." Valen looked at the plans scrolling on the screen. It was a monstrosity, a moon-sized fortress of guns and armor. It was ugly, it was brutal, and it was exactly what they needed. "The project implies a total militarization of our economy," Valen noted, his politician's mind already calculating the logistics. "It will require the dismantling of pleasure worlds for resources. It will mean the end of the golden age of art." "The golden age is over, Exarch," Vance said softly. "The age of iron has begun. You can either build the wall, or you can be the view." The decision was not made instantly. There were days of debate. The philosophers of the Ascendancy argued that survival at the cost of culture was no survival at all. They argued that becoming brutes like the humans was a degradation of their spirit. But every time the debate grew heated, the sensors would ping with another system going dark on the rim. The Null were still running, and in their panic they were scorching the Earth behind them. And behind them, the Entropics were getting closer. Eventually, the logic of survival prevailed. The alliance was ratified. The shipyards of Valcora, once famous for producing the pleasure yachts of the elite, began to retool. The delicate crystal-growing vats were replaced by blast furnaces. The poets were retrained as riveters. It was a cultural trauma, a painful metamorphosis, but humanity was there to guide them. Human engineers flooded the Ascendancy worlds. They were loud, they drank strange liquids, and they swore constantly, but they worked with a tireless intensity that awed the aliens. They showed the Ascendancy how to forge collapsed matter alloy. They taught them the beauty of redundancy, why having a manual lever to open a door was better than a psychic sensor when the power failed. Months turned into a year. The war against the retreating Null continued, but now it was different. The Ascendancy ships began to change. They were still sleek, but they were plated in matte black armor. They carried railguns alongside their plasma lances, and leading every fleet was a Terran brick, acting as the shield, the lightning rod that drew the fire while the faster alien ships struck from the shadows. The culmination of this alliance, and the true test of the junk philosophy, came when the first entropic scout manifested. It happened in the Zenith system, a major industrial hub where the first of the new Titan-class ships was being constructed. The warning came not from sensors, but from the psychics of the Ethel Guard. They screamed. Thousands of them, all at once, collapsing in agony as a presence entered the system that felt like ice picks in the mind. Space didn't tear open, it simply ceased to be. A sphere of absolute nothingness appeared near the system's star. It was invisible to the eye, detectable only by the way it lensed the starlight around it. It moved toward the star, and as it did, the star began to dim. It was feeding. Vance was on the bridge of the newly refitted Hephaestus. He felt the coldness in his gut, a primal instinct that screamed predator. "Target profile," he barked. "Undefined," the sensor officer replied. "It's not matter, it's a field of negation. Diameter. 4,000 kilometers. It's heading for the sun. If it feeds, it'll cause a supernova that will wipe out the shipyard." "Fleetmaster Zykes," Vance hailed the alien commander who was commanding the defensive perimeter. "You see it." "I feel it," Zykes replied, his voice strained. "Our weapons, they cannot lock on. There is nothing to lock onto. It is a ghost." "It's not a ghost," Vance growled. "It's a mouth, and we're going to choke it." "Admirals." "Deploy the sledgehammer rounds," Vance ordered. The crew paused. Sledgehammer rounds were theoretical. They were solid spheres of ultradense matter, compressed until they were on the verge of becoming black holes, suspended in a magnetic stasis field. They were the heaviest things humanity had ever built. "Sir, if we fire those, the recoil will tear the spine off the ship," the weapons officer warned. "If we don't fire them, we're dust. Fire." The Hephaestus shuddered. A sound like the cracking of a planet's crust reverberated through the hull. 2 projectiles, each the size of a small building, were launched. They were not fast, not by railgun standards, but they were heavy. They carried the mass of a mountain range. They sailed through the void, ignoring the electronic screams of the dying star. They entered the sphere of nothingness. For a moment, nothing happened. The sphere continued to move. Then a ripple, a distortion. The entropic entity, expecting energy to consume, had instead swallowed a lump of matter so dense that it couldn't be digested. The stomach of the entity couldn't break down the degenerate matter. It was like throwing a rock into a delicate engine. The invisible sphere convulsed. A shockwave of anti-reality burst outward, shattering the nearest moon. But the sphere stopped. It began to shrink, vibrating violently. "It's choking," Vance yelled. "All ships, kinetic bombardment, pour it on, don't give it energy to eat, give it rocks, give it metal, bury it." The Ascendancy fleet, overcoming their terror, obeyed. Thousands of ships, modified with human mass drivers, opened fire. A storm of tungsten and steel rained down on the writhing entity. It was the most primitive form of warfare imaginable, stoning the enemy to death, conducted on a stellar scale. The entropic scout, unable to process the sheer influx of physical matter, reached critical mass. It couldn't maintain its negation field against the onslaught of physical reality. With a sound that was felt rather than heard, a psychic shriek of defeat, it imploded. The sphere vanished, leaving behind a cloud of superheated dust and the 2 sledgehammer rounds spinning quietly in the void. The star flared back to life. The system was safe. On the bridge of the Hephaestus, there was no cheering, just the heavy breathing of men and women who had looked into the abyss and spat in its eye. Valen's face appeared on the comms. He looked shaken, his bioluminescence dim. We killed it. We killed a god with stones." "Not a god," Vance said, leaning back in his chair, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his cold coffee. "Just a predator, and we're not prey anymore." The victory at Zenith proved the concept. The junk was not just a stopgap, it was the answer. The universe was not a place of light and magic, it was a place of cold, hard physics. And humanity, in its stubborn refusal to transcend the physical, had accidentally built the ultimate weapon against the metaphysical. The final phase of the war, or the beginning of the Long War as historians would later call it, marked a shift in the galactic order. The Ascendancy was no longer an empire of aesthetics. It became a fortress. The borders were lined with brick stations, massive, ugly, and unassailable. The Titan dreadnoughts were launched, ships so large they possessed their own gravity wells, capable of firing moon-sized projectiles across systems. But the true climax of the story wasn't a battle, it was a revelation. Years later, Admiral Vance, now an old man, stood on the observation deck of the UNS Terra Nova, the flagship of the combined fleet. Beside him stood High Exarch Valen. They were looking out at the edge of the galaxy, where the Great Dark began. The attacks had stopped. The entropics had tested the line, found it made of iron, and recoiled. They were predators of opportunity, and the Milky Way had become a porcupine. "We have peace for now," Valen said, "but they are still out there." "They will always be out there," Vance replied. "That's the nature of the dark." "You changed us, Hideo," Valen said reflectively. "We used to look at the stars and see art. Now we see firing solutions. I worry that we have lost our soul." Vance turned to the alien, his face lined with the scars of 100 battles. "You didn't lose your soul, Valen. You just put it in a safe. You learned that you have to build a house before you can hang paintings. There's no shame in being a bricklayer." Valen looked at the human, this representative of the piece of junk species. He realized then that the humans were not actually warriors at heart. They were builders. They built walls to keep the monsters out so their children could sleep. They made themselves ugly so that others could be beautiful. "There is one thing I never asked you," Valen said. "The Hephaestus, the first ship, you said it was built for the war that hadn't started, but the logs show it was 300 years old when it arrived at Valcora. What was it doing before?" Vance smiled, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You remember I said we intercepted the signals from the null? We did, but we also found something else. A structure, floating in the void between our galaxies, ancient. It wasn't built by the null or the entropics." Vance tapped a command on his cane, a piece of the hull of the original Hephaestus. A hologram appeared. It showed a massive, ring-like structure, dormant and cold. "It's a gate," Vance said. "We didn't build the Hephaestus just to fight. We built it to be a key, the ship's density, its specific resonant frequency. It matches the lock mechanism of this gate. The Hephaestus wasn't just a warship, Valen. It was a physical encryption key designed to withstand the pressures of opening a door to somewhere else." Valen stared at the image. "Where does it go?" "We don't know yet," Vance admitted. "But the entropics, they aren't just eating galaxies. They're trying to find this gate. They want to get in, or maybe they want to keep something in." He looked out at the stars, the great wall of ships guarding the galaxy. "We spent the last decade turning this galaxy into a fortress," Vance whispered. "But maybe we weren't building a fortress. Maybe we were building a prison or a cradle. We're going to take the Hephaestus to the gate next week. We're going to turn the key." "And if it opens?" Valen asked, fear mixing with curiosity. "Then we find out what's on the other side," Vance said. "And if it's hostile, well, we have plenty of rocks." The camera pulled back through the viewport, past the two old friends, past the massive, scarred hull of the Terra Nova, pulling back to reveal the galaxy. It was no longer a swirl of fragile light. It was studded with Ron, it was bristling with guns. It was ugly. It was dangerous. And it was alive. The piece of junk had not only saved the galaxy, it had hardened it. Humanity had taught the stars a lesson they would never forget. Elegance is ephemeral. Survival is heavy. And the most advanced warship ever risen wasn't the one with the brightest lasers. It was the one that refused to break. As the credits of history rolled, the Hephaestus, repaired, refitted, and eternal, ignited its engines one last time, heading not for a battlefield, but for the locked door at the end of the universe, ready to kick it down.